Today's lesson is a more advanced lesson on the NParticle system. We're going to look at some of the more advanced features that you can start adding into an NParticle system. So we're going to start off by showing how simple it is to add a texture to an NParticle system. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my menu set is set to effects just so I can get access to all the NParticle stuff. And make sure your workspace is on classic so that you have a basic timeline to work with. I'm going to go ahead down here to the bottom and expand my timeline to 500 frames. I'm just going to save as I go because this is it does take up a lot of your computer resources when you start messing around with particles. So don't just leave a blank document open while you're doing this. All right, I'm going to go up to the top here to NParticles, and I'm going to come down to create emitter. This is good, and then I'm going to move my emitter's position. There we go. I'm going to move it up in the air just so we can see it a little bit. I'll go to my attribute editor, and I'm going to click on NParticle shape, and then I'm going to come down to shading here and change from points to spheres, and let's see what we get. Cool, I got a nice shower of spheres that are raining down. Perfect. So now that I have this, I'm going to click on the NParticle just so you can kind of see the group of all the particles that were just created. I'm going to save again here. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to assign a new material. I'm going to add an Arnold AI standard surface, and I'm just going to change the color on this to like a bright cyan. Now you're not going to see this in the render view. In your just viewport. But if I go to render this, as long as I add some light to the scene, since it's the Arnold render and whatnot, I'm going to save again. I'll bring up my render preview and let's see how it does. There we go. So you can see, even though I can't see the color in my viewport, just preview there, it will render whatever textures I add onto the scene. So if I go back on that, I could go back to the AI standard surface and I could change this around. Add all sorts of translucency. This is where things get really fun because you could add a luminance quality to it. You could have it actually emit light. You could give it a little bit of a fuzzy texture. You could do all sorts of different things to make it look like snow or rain or leaves if you wanted to add like a photo-based texture, etc. Now, some of those will really increase your render time, but it's good to know that you can add any textures you want to a live particle system. All right, I'm going to close this. So now we have some particles here. What I'd like to show next is how we can emit particles from an object. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these particles that I just created. And I'm going to come back up to NParticles. And before I do that, I'm going to actually just bring an object in that I'm going to actually emit from. So I'll make like a kind of a spherical cloud shape, right? Just as an idea of thinking about like rain. Widen this out a little bit, and I'll go ahead and raise this up. Alright, cool. So I can have the whole object emit, and what it's going to do is every vertex, so if I go to vertex mode, every vertex will become an emitter. And that can be a lot, but it can also be kind of cool. So I'll go back to object mode. I've got my object. I'm going to go to NParticles, and I'm going to just go right below create emitter to emit from object. And now you'll see, sorry, let me click on NParticles there. I'll just back this up. There we go. Looks like a crazy, I don't know what to call that, like a sea dollar or ocean. Yeah, kind of a, yeah, it's just emitting from every single vertex on there. That's a whole lot of points to work with, but still pretty cool that any object you want to create could then become an emitter, right? The whole object. Or if we want to kind of back up a little bit, I'm going to undo some of this. Cool, and save. I can also take a face selection, which I think is a better way to go at it so that you don't have the whole thing going, like super crazy. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and choose some faces. So I'm going to just kind of grab these center guys, and while those are selected, I can go again to NParticles and emit from object. Now it's only going to emit from where my selection was. That's way more controllable, and then I could have the whole bottom surface of this emit or just a certain zone. I'll often do this if, say, I have like a pipe and I want water to flow out of it using a particle system. I'll just select kind of like right where the hole would be on the pipe, like if I kind of extrude in a little area at the end of the pipe, make it look like it's hollow, and then I'll just have that area literally emit the particles and it'll flow just like water would. So really powerful. Often I just do emit from object more than I would do um, a just standard particle system. Now on the emitter, obviously you can still go from an omni to directional. You can do all those different things. That's up to you. You can control gravity. Everything is still the same, but you're emitting from an object instead of just that invisible particle emitter. All right, so there's that. Next thing I want to show you is how you can turn an object into a particle. This is kind of cool. So for this one, I'm going to go to NParticle and create a standard emitter. I'll move it up again. And this time I'm going to add an object into the scene. I'm going to bring in a torus. And let me just play with the radius of that a little bit. Let's go with like 0.25. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to bring this down a little bit, 0.5. So let's bring that down 0.1. There we go, cool. So now, if I take the torus, if I select the torus, and I hold down Command, and I also choose the NParticle, and I go to NParticles, I can do the instancer. And you'll see I now have an instancer object that has brought in. It does have some controls in here. You'll see it's actually referencing the P torus because I had it selected when I created it. And now, if I go back to my NParticle, I'm just going to back up, you'll see it is making a whole lot of toruses. Now keep in mind, if you put like a really complex polygonal object that you've modeled out and smoothed and done a bunch of sculpting work on it, and you turn it into a particle, you better have a serious CPU GPU system going on, because it is going to chunk up your system depending on how many particles you make, and rendering is going to take an exceptional amount of time. So I tend to, when I am using objects, I tend to keep them as simple objects. You can still sculpt them and mess with them a little bit, but watch the amount of subdivision you do on them, watch the amount of smoothing that you add to them, okay? Now you'll see that original torus is still showing up there in the midst of all these particles. So if you want to hide that, just click on the original torus, hit H on your keyboard. All the particles will still remain, but that one that was just like floating in the middle will not. And what's cool about this is I can still do everything that would normally happen with particles. I could make a plane here, and I could turn that into a collider. So I could come up to nCloth and create a passive collider. And then I could click on my NParticles again and play around with collisions. I can make them self-collide, and I could give them some bounce. And there they go. They're kind of, well, that's interesting. The self-collide does not seem to be functioning the way I would have expected it to. Like maybe my collision strength, we'll have to work on that one. Self-colliding usually means they would be bouncing off of each other, but they do look like they're still merging with each other, which is interesting. So now that turned off all collision, so let's turn that back on. So that's interesting with an emit object. I'll have to work on figuring out why those guys are still merging the way they are. They are kind of pushing out. It might be just something to do with this particular shape. I'm not sure of how they're layering on top, because they are pushing each other, which is really interesting. So anyway, most of the time you can still do what you want to do. I could increase the bounce on these guys so they're kind of bouncing off of each other a little bit more. I could bring down the friction. How many collisions? It's just a lot that it's trying to deal with right now. I might need to just take down the count. Or actually, I'm sorry, not the count, but the live forever. Maybe give them a constant range if they only live for 6 seconds or so. Anyway, lots to play with here, but you can really have a lot of fun as you start to work with objects. There we go. Now we're pushing them out. They're still colliding in kind of a weird way, but we'll just have to keep working on those settings. All right, next thing I want to show you is how you can convert an NParticle into a polygon. All right, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of these guys, the instancer and everything. We're just going to go back to a regular particle. So we're going to go to create emitter. Same drill. I'm going to move this up. I'm going to save real quick just in case I'm running out of memory. And I am going to go back to the NParticle shape. Let me close up some of these other tabs. Go to shading here. I'm going to go back to spheres. Okay, cool. So now I've got a bunch of spheres. Now watch what happens if I go to modify and convert. I'm going to do NParticle to polygons. And I think that worked. Let's see. I might have had the wrong thing selected. Nope, I think I had the wrong thing selected. Hold on. Let's choose I had the emitter instead of the NParticle. So choose the NParticle, modify, convert, NParticle to polygon. All right, now let's try that. There we go. Now it's kind of weird right now, and that's because we have to set a few settings. It's just this weird little like diamond shape. So that's where you need to go to your output mesh tab under the NParticle shape. And here's where we kind of play around with a few things. So threshold really matters. If this is up too high, it actually completely disappears. But as you scale that down, you get this really nice kind of like blobby, almost liquid-like form to it. And I can also play with like how big the blobs are, like if I wanted to all merge together with that blobby radius scale, or if I still want it to be a little bit particle-y. And then the motion streak also kind of like blends them together in an interesting way. You can get like one big solid mass. So it's kind of like without having to do one of the more advanced liquid simulations, you can start to get some like muddy, liquidy, gel-like stuff going on. You can play with the triangle size, or you can reduce that considerably and make it way more accurate, although this takes more processing power. Ooh, let me go to 0.01, I think is what I wanted. Oh, no, that's a little too much apparently. That's funny. So there's a threshold there where suddenly it bursts out, but 0.172 it was happy with. So I can kind of go here and play that, and now I'm actually creating polygonal shapes when I'm doing this, which is cool. And as you can see, that's going all the way down based on the length of it. And if at any point I want to freeze this object as a just a polygonal object, I can just choose the poly surface, and I can go to edit, and I can go delete by type and delete history. I don't want to do that because I'm going to show you one more lesson, and I'd have to recreate this whole thing afterwards because you can't undo a delete history. But that's how you delete history, and then no matter what you did on the timeline, that particle mass that has been converted to a polygon surface will be frozen that way, and then you could sculpt it, you could scale it, you could play with all of those shapes. It's up to you. Keep in mind there are some settings you can do as well. When I'm in here, if I do back up a little bit before I converted, I believe I'm back to standard, yeah, before I converted. So I choose my NParticle and I go down to modify and convert. Oh, you know what? I was wrong on that. I thought I had a settings window that I could do on that, but that's okay. So I'm going to bring that threshold back down, bring the blobby back, a little bit of streak, bring that down. Alright, cool. Now we have a nice mass to work with. Alright, cool. So there we go. That's how to convert NParticles to polygonal shapes. The last thing I want to show you, and this is just kind of a fun little introduction, a more advanced kind of motion graphics system that we have built into Maya. It will work with single objects. It will work with particles that have been converted to polygons like we see here. It does take a bit of processing power, but I want to show you the MASH system. And this is just a very quick intro. We're going to do a future lesson that goes way more into what MASH can do for motion graphics design. So you can see when I selected MASH workspace over here, I get a whole bunch of additional tools there. And I want to take a look here and see what we can do. So first off, you'll see I have now got my polygon surface here, and I'm going to go to the MASH tab here up at the top. I'm going to choose the poly surface, and I'm going to hit this little button on the far left, which is create a MASH network. The minute I do that, by default, it created a distributed MASH network, which is basically just like a duplicate of that MASH network. And here you see, these are all different types of MASH nodes that we'll look at in a future lesson. Right now, we just did a simple one, which was just sort of like a distributed network. So, as you can see up here, there's a tab called MASH1 Distribute. I want you to see what happens as I work with these. I can take how many points on the network, like I can have more than 10, or I can play around with the distance of how far they're spread apart. This is taking an instance of one and copying it. So it's not like it has to process every single one over and over. It's just processing one and kind of duplicating it in space. But I can also play around with the distribution on the Y. This is This is the linear distribution type, so I can give it a Y angle or a Z depth angle. As I pan around this, you can see how it's starting to get a little bit of a different vibe to it. I could rotate them and get almost like a helix pattern that's starting to happen, which is really cool. And I can actually still animate all this. Like I can still get some really cool effects that are happening here as this particle system converted to polygons is now being repeated. It's almost like a duplicate special, but for way more complex possibilities, right? And I could continue. I could have it rotate in any direction that I want right now. I could get a lot of different variation on it. But aside from all that, I'm going to bring these back. I can also choose between linear. I could go to a radial pattern instead of a linear pattern. And again, I can play with how big that radius is. I can play with the angle if I want to go full 360 or just like have a little wave of them. As I do this and back it up, you can see how they're coming inward and then sort of bouncing together and going back out. You can get some really cool pattern work doing this, right? X and Y, or you can do Y and Z, or Z and X, whatever orientation you want to do it on. We also have spherical, which kind of gives you this like big cluster vibe of them. It tries to make sort of a sphere out of them. And again, if I increase this, I'm going to get a more dense sphere, but obviously it takes up a bit more processing power as well. So there they all kind of coming in to this spherical volume. And I think that's a good one to stop with. Some of these get a little bit more advanced. You can do a grid. That's kind of a fun one where it'll like block them out. And I can decide like, the distance between my grids and also the grid size, like how many items I want to be gridded. Don't go too crazy on that, but I can start to almost make like a cube-like distribution of these on the X and Z and have that happen as well. So sometimes you want to make something kind of like a little techie vibe like that where they're all pouring down. Yeah, pretty fun stuff. I think that's a good place to start. Play around with some of those. Like I said, we're going to work with some of the more advanced mesh systems in a future tutorial. But between the NParticles more advanced features and then bringing the NParticles that have been converted to polys into mesh, you should have a lot of fun. Just remember, you can't just bring a regular NParticle in. It has to be converted to a polygonal mesh for it to work with the mesh network. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for tuning in, and look forward to a future lesson on the mesh network.